I'm sure you've all heard of zombie games, and they're all fun to a certain extent, but when you have a game that has infected instead of zombies, with a great emotional story, you have a game that's all around very fun and with a very great narrative. The Last of Us Part 2 is a sequel set 4 years after the first game, and many people hated it based on a few things that they didn't like, forgetting about what made the game so good. Most people have played, as I've already said, zombie games or at least heard of them, but in this game they're called infected, not zombies, because they're not dead and they've been infected with the cordyceps virus. I first played The Last of Us in 2017, and it's been my favorite game ever since then. And I was ecstatic to hear that they'd be making a part 2. And I finally played part 2 when it was released in June of this year, and I've been playing it almost non-stop ever since then. Today, I'm going to talk about what happens in both The Last of Us and part 2, and why so many people hated it for all the wrong reasons, and why it is still such a great game. This goes without saying, but major spoilers follow for both The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2, and I would say don't watch my speech if you want to play any of these games. You have been warned. The Last of Us is set 20 years after the outbreak of the cordyceps virus, which makes people crazy and want to kill everyone around them. The game chronicles the story of Joel and Ellie, a 50-ish-year-old man and a 14-year-old girl. Ellie's bitten a few weeks before the events of the game occur, but she's seen to have no signs of infection, and she's seemingly immune to the virus. Joel is then tasked with taking Ellie across the country to a group called the Fireflies so that the doctors there can operate on her and figure out why she's immune, maybe even create a vaccine. When the game first starts, Joel is very resentful of Ellie as she puts him in danger a lot. But as the game goes on, the relationship mends and turns into a really beautiful one, where it seems like they've been father-daughter for a very long time. Towards the end of the game, they finally reach the Fireflies, and the doctors take Ellie from Joel. And Joel talks to the leader of the Fireflies, who tells Joel that the doctors will be taking the tumor out of Ellie's brain, which makes her immune to the virus, and that would kill her. And Joel's not happy with this, and he decides to escape custody of the Fireflies and find Ellie and save her, but not before he kills all the Fireflies that go in his way. At the end of the game, they share one last emotional conversation, and Joel lies to Ellie, telling her that they couldn't get a vaccine for her because it was just impossible at the time. He says this because 20 years ago, when the outbreak happened, he lost his only daughter to a human being, not even an infected, which solidified the fact for him that the world did not care at all about him, so why should he care about the world? In a very emotional ending, Ellie tells Joel to swear that he told the truth about the Fireflies, and Joel does exactly that, swearing right to her face. The Last of Us paved the way for Part 2, and the story picks up pretty much where the game left off. The Last of Us Part 2 is set 4 years after the events of the first, except for the beginning, where Joel tells his brother Tommy about how he saved Ellie and what he did to the Fireflies, and Tommy responds telling him that he doesn't know if he could have done any different in that situation, and his secret is safe. And as Joel promised Ellie in the first game, he gives her a guitar and teaches her how to play. Fast forward 4 years into the future, present day, and it shows Ellie living in a nice town. But on the same day, Joel is ambushed by a group of people from another city, and he's brutally murdered with a golf club by a girl named Abby and her group of friends. This prompts Ellie to set herself on revenge and follow those people all the way to Seattle to kill them all. When she finally gets to Seattle, Ellie, one by one, kills all the people who came to Ellie's town and killed Joel. And towards the end of her stay in Seattle, Ellie confronts a man and a woman, two of Abby's friends, and forces them to tell her where Abby is. But when they refuse, Ellie, without thinking, kills them both. And she shortly after that finds out that the woman was actually pregnant with her unborn child. And this makes Ellie feel very guilty and prompts her to then leave Seattle without going after Abby. But before she can actually leave Seattle, she's ambushed by Abby, and the game shows that Abby pointing a gun at Ellie's face, and then the screen goes black. And then the game lets us control Abby 4 years ago, before the events of the game occur. And in this flashback, it's shown that the doctor in part 1 that Joel killed is actually Abby's father, and Abby herself set herself on revenge for her father's death 4 years ago. Fast forward 4 years to the same day that Ellie reached Seattle, Abby is traveling through the city when she's ambushed by a nearby cult. Right before she's about to be hung, Abby is saved by two kids, both running away from the cult, a boy and a girl, and they get away from a bunch of infected that Abby saved them from, and Abby leads them to a safe place for the night, but not before seeing that the girl's elbow was hammered in. Abby decides to help the kids and save the girl's life by getting medical supplies so that her pregnant friend can help both of them and maybe even save the girl's life. After saving the girl's life, the boy runs away to his mom to get them to join Abby and her friends. But since she's still in the cult, Abby and the girl follow the boy and try to save his life. The girl dies on the way back to Seattle, but Abby and the boy both make it back safely. And when they come back, they find that Abby's friends are both dead. And shortly after this, they go and find Ellie, and they finally ambush her. And then the game shows the same scene that they showed earlier in the game. But this time, they finish the scene and shows Abby and Ellie having a fight. Abby gains the upper hand and almost kills Ellie, but decides to let her go and let her live. A few months later, Ellie is shown to have severe PTSD, and she decides to go out and find Abby, and she finally does. When she does finally find Abby, she sees that Abby is tied to a pillar in the middle of some lake. She decides to cut her down and have a fight. They start to fight, and Abby bites 2 of Ellie's fingers off, but Ellie gains the upper hand after that, has her hands around Abby's throat, ready to kill her, but then she decides to let go after she has a vision of Joel playing the guitar on his porch. When Abby gets back to her home, she finds that her girlfriend left and took all of their belongings. But she still left Ellie's guitar, and Ellie tries to play the guitar, but then soon figures out that she can't because she lost her ring and pinky finger on her left hand. And she leaves the guitar that Joel got her in the windowsill, and the game ends with Ellie walking out of her yard as the camera pans all the way to the guitar. The Last of Us Part 2 may not be a great game, but it was definitely a very well told story with a perfect sequel to Part 1. Many people did not like Part 2 based on a few things that they hated, but they totally forgot about the things that made the game so good. To start off, people hated how the creators killed Joel like he was nothing, because they thought he deserved a more peaceful death, but they seem to forget the world that he lives in. Nothing peaceful ever happens. If you're gonna die, you're gonna die a brutal death. And from the enemy's point of view, the antagonist's point of view in this game, it seems that they killed Joel because they took away Ellie, or I should say took away the vaccine from them, took away the hope for the world. And from Joel's point of view, this makes sense why he did it, because of his daughter and dying 20 years ago. But to them, it just seems like he just doesn't care about the world. Another thing was the fact that the creators made us play as Abby just as long as they made us play as Ellie. And I must admit, when I first played, I let out a huge sigh when I first played as Abby, because I don't want to play as her. I hated her. But as the game went on and a few more playthroughs, I started to understand her story and I started to love Abby for who she is. Another thing people disliked about the game was how they, quote-unquote, tried to make us sympathize with Abby and her story, but I think the creators did this pretty well, because Abby's also shown to have PTSD, and she keeps having recurring nightmares of seeing her father dead on the ground in the hospital, and these dreams don't even stop after she kills Joel. And when she has to save the kids, she has another nightmare. Instead of seeing her father dead on the ground, she sees the 2 kids hung with their intestines out of their bodies, prompting her to save them. And these dreams only stop when she saves the 2 kids. And then she just have normal dreams, walking into the hospital room and seeing her father alive and well, smiling at her. In addition, she has this... People also hated the fact that Ellie is just a mere shell of her former self, because she's nothing compared to the person she was in the first and second games. Once again, you have to be thankful for what you have, especially in a world like this, where everything can be taken away just like that. Because the world is very, very unpredictable, and you never know what's going to come next. And another thing that people don't like about Part 2 are the characters and how they were portrayed. In Part 1, the characters were all very unique and strong in their own ways, and everyone loved them all. But in Part 2, they seemed kind of bland and just very, very common. But I think in this case, the characters don't really matter as much, the side characters don't matter as much, because the game is clearly based on the actions of both Ellie and Abby. People also hated the pacing of this game, saying that it was too slow at times. But I think it was just fine. Maybe a little too slow at times, but only when it needed to be slow. And it picked up when it had to pick up, and it was slow when it had to be slow. All in all, I think that people really hated this game because they set the bar way too high after playing part 1. And if part 2 was anything below that bar, they hated it instantly. Today, I talked about The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2, and why people hated the sequel so much as compared to the first game, as well as why it was so good, actually, with a complex story. I think because the first game was so great, everyone thought that the second game was going to be just the same thing, just as great, but when it turned out that it wasn't, everyone hated it and everything in the game. Even though people don't like it at all, I still think it was a very good game that was a very great sequel for the first game. The Last of Us will go down in history as one of the greatest games of all time. Maybe part 2 is not even close to it, but it's definitely a masterpiece that no game will ever come close to.